The Civil War in prose. For literally 100 years after the American Civil War, the conventional wisdom was that no great literature had really been written during the time of the war. There might have been Stephen Crane's remarkable novel, The Red Badge of Courage, but that was published 20 years or so after the war. Stephen Crane had not even been alive when the Civil War was taking place. And we owe primarily our sense of this lack of literary culture during the Civil War to one Walt Whitman, the great American poet, who famously wrote in his memoir Specimen Days, quote, "The real war will never get into the books." Whitman was a Civil War nurse who helped many wounded young men in the hospitals of Washington, D.C. throughout the Civil War. He wrote some wonderful poems about the Civil War, but it was his conviction that the actual experience of war, the traumatic events of those years would simply not something that would get into a work of literature. When I read this famous quote, I always want to say, really, Walt? Because later scholars would suggest that the Civil War was actually one of the most literate and literary wars in American history. Edmund Wilson, who is the author of the first real study of American literature during the Civil War, entitled Patriotic Gore, said, "Has there ever been another historical crisis of the magnitude of 1861 to 1865 in which so many people were so articulate?" And he was referring to letters written home and to soldiers from the home front, as well as a wide range of newspaper and magazine reportage and fiction. And Wilson wants to suggest that, in fact, this was a very literary war in that there were so many literate participants in the war. Flash forward or fast forward some 50 years later, and Louis Mazur in The Civil War, A Concise History, said the Civil War was above all else a, quote, written war. So what does Walt Whitman mean exactly when he says the real war will never get into the books? I'm going to focus on the word real, because it is something of a truism to think that what emerged from the Civil War was something that we call literary realism, a new way of looking at literary subject matter in a manner that was more realistic, was less idealistic, less flowery in style, more hard-nosed, more clear-eyed. And Whitman is suggesting, I think, when he says the real war will never get into the books, that the literary culture that he is a part of, that transcendentalist, antebellum literary culture, is not really equipped entirely to confront the Civil War and all of the violence and the pain that it wrought. So this leads to some preliminary questions that I think it's important to think about as we explore the issue of prose during the Civil War. Was it possible that the prose forms that were already in place, by which I mean sermons, journalism, essays, fiction, were those able to convincingly represent the unprecedented violence of the Civil War? Or was a new language going to need to be invented, and new forms of writing? Were they going to need to be invented in order to meet the challenge of trying to capture the experience of the Civil War? These are sort of meta questions that a literary scholar might ask, and as a way of looking at any kind of changes or shifts in literary practice that occur during one of these kind of watershed moments in history. To try to answer those questions, I tend to take two approaches. And the first of these is to rely upon some key terms that I have adapted from Raymond Williams' 1977 book called Marxism in Literature. And Williams was interested in trying to trace changes in culture and to identify how a culture changed. And in doing so, he came up with three key terms. The first one of those is dominant. These are the primary forms of cultural expression that are evident in everyday practice. They're the main ways that we talk about ourselves as a culture. Residual is a term that refers to cultural forms from the past that are still active in the current cultural process. And emergent is a term that refers to new cultural forms and expressive practices created in a society. So that's one way I think about these questions. Is I first of all want to be able to identify moments in literary history that are dominant, residual, or emergent. And the second way I think about this is to go to visual examples. And I'm thinking here primarily of how useful this is for students. Sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words, and you can convey a lot about a culture's emotional atmosphere in a picture that would take a lot of prose to actually unlock for them. So here's an example of what I would call a residual cultural form that is trying to make sense of the Civil War. And this is a painting by Emanuel Gottfried Lutz, who is a well-known historical painter in the 19th century who painted murals in the Capitol Rotunda. But in his efforts to make sense of the Civil War, he painted angel hovering over a battlefield. And it's a dark painting, and it's not entirely easy to discern what's going on, but you can see above here is an angel who is inscribing the names of those lost in a battle in the book of life, thereby honoring their sacrifice. Below here is the Civil War dead. Those men from both the North and the South who have lost their lives in a battle. There's a variety of different uniforms. They are strewn about heterogeneously. It's not really a painting about a Northern or a Southern victory or defeat. It is a painting that is meant to show that the war affects both the North and the South, and that an afterlife represented by the angel is the solace that these men will have received for the sacrifice that they've made. That's a residual. That is a cultural form that Lutz has the history of painting to draw upon. Here is an emergent form, and that is photographic realism. It's sort of interesting to compare the horizon in these two works of art. The horizon in Lutz's painting is very low, because suggesting, it seems to me, that the real story is what happens not in this life, but in the afterlife, in heaven. Here we are very firmly on the ground. There is no transcendence here. There is the visceral photographic representation of men who have perished in a war. And this is an a kind of foretelling of the kind of photographic realism that is going to occur in literature after the Civil War, in literary realism and then naturalism. What, though, is the dominant form during the Civil War? And I would argue that it is a kind of mashup. It's unsettled. It's a very much a mixture of that residual idealism and emergent realism. If we look at literary prose, or prose of all sorts, during the Civil War, what we will find is that it oscillates wildly between a kind of idealism that we recognize from the transcendentalist and from the Christian tradition, with a realism that is much starker, much less transcendent, much more grounded in the here and now. And I would point out these the newspaper sketches that the painter Winslow Homer made throughout the Civil War for a variety of different newspapers, as an example of this mashup. There, it is both heroic in subject matter often, but also there's a new realism that kind of creeps in to his work. And this, for me, exemplifies the primary literary mode of the Civil War. It's a combination of idealism and realism. With that as a kind of background, then there are some essential questions that we should probably ask ourselves before we look at the types of Civil War prose that were written between 1861 and 1865. What were those prose forms? What was published and read during the Civil War? How did literature shape the meaning of the war? That is, how did Civil War prose help readers to make sense of the seemingly senseless violence that they experienced? How did the war, on the other hand, alter American literature? And I think I've already somewhat hinted at the direction that American literature will go, with a greater realism following the war. And how might our encounters with the Civil War, with Civil War prose, reshape our ways of viewing American literary history and American history per se? So, in general, when I teach Civil War prose, I break down the available forms into 5 categories: literature of emancipation, speeches and lectures, journals, letters, and memoirs of soldiers, periodical fiction. I spend a lot of time on periodical fiction, and women's literature of war and the home front, and I tend to spend a lot of time with that category as well. The 3 that I have boxed in yellow here are the 3 that I tend to most focus on and will in this talk. But very quickly, I'll touch on the other 2. Literature of emancipation, I think, is an extremely important category of literary production for students to be aware of, and wonderfully, so much of this material is now available in all kinds of digital archives, which I have listed in the resources at the end of this PowerPoint, which will be made available to you. The Anglo-African magazine was a prominent magazine produced and written by African Americans advancing the cause of abolition and emancipation. And of course, the best-selling book of all time in the 19th century, second only to the Bible, was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a true cultural phenomenon that transformed the way many people thought about slavery and the issue of emancipation. The literature of emancipation is important primarily as a catalyst before the Civil War begun, and both the literature that comes out of the North and the responses out of the South are certainly of great interest to scholars, and I think to your students who want to see the argument for emancipation as it was being formulated. The other category, which I won't spend much time on today, but that is extremely interesting for your students, is journals, letters, and memoirs of soldiers. And these are a largely untapped resource. So many of them have not been published, but every university library and state historical society has a collection of letters and journals written by soldiers and those who remained at home, who are writing to soldiers and keeping journals. And in my own research, every time I go to one of these university library websites or historical society websites and find a digitized cache of letters, it's like a revelation. The stories that the soldiers tell their family about life in the during wartime, and the journals that people on the home front keep are excellent ways of getting a sense of life during this period. A very good resource for you to look at is the National Park Service's website devoted to the Battle of Antietam, which is full of letters and diaries of soldiers and civilians. Okay. When I teach Civil War prose, though, I tend to focus on the next three categories. One is the speeches and addresses of well-known figures. And in part, that's because the 19th century was known as a century of eloquence and oration. Almost certainly the most powerful speaker of the 19th century was Frederick Douglass, whose rhetorical prowess and delivery were famous at the time as almost equivalent to ancient Roman orators. Abraham Lincoln is also an excellent source for showing your students how language reacted and changed to the conditions of the Civil War. And what I mean by that is you can compare snippets from Lincoln's first inaugural delivered when he took office in March 1861, after something like 12 Confederate states had already seceded from the Union. And his task was multi-pronged. He wanted to persuade the nation, which was literally crumbling at the moment. He wanted to try to persuade the nation to not fracture any further, but rather to stick together as a union. He wanted to present himself not as an agent of change during this very tumultuous time, but as an agent of stability. And he finally wanted to assert, without angering the South, the illegality of secession. So you could present your students with just a couple of paragraphs to see the kind of rhetorical tightrope walking Lincoln does in his first inaugural. I'm going to read this first bubble here. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. This language is very legalistic. It's in so often in the passive voice. Apprehension seems to exist. Their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. It's very measured. It's very Latinate. It's very indirect. It's the speech of a lawyer trying to make a case before the jury that is the United States of America. Let's compare it to the Gettysburg Address, delivered in the wake of the bloodiest battle in the Civil War, which occurred over the 3 days of July 1st through 3rd, 1863, with an estimated number of casualties at over 50,000 people. It's often considered to be the turning point of the Civil War, and Lincoln's effort to sum up its meaning comes in at an extremely terse and brief 272 words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A number of scholars have spent a lot of time and energy parsing these 272 words. I would just say here that Lincoln is no longer the legalistic lawyer making a very careful and hedged argument before the nation. He is now writing in a much crisper, telegraphic style that at the same time is almost prophetic and biblical in its import. And many scholars believe that this is one of the things that happened during the Civil War, is that American language simplified. It shed itself of adjectives and adverbs that were perceived unnecessary, and as distractions. It became much more the kind of speech and literary language that we recognize today. Another category of prose during the Civil War, periodical fiction. This is in many ways the most interesting material to look at. Now online, there are digital versions of literally dozens and dozens of magazines and hundreds of newspapers during this time period that produced all kinds of fiction about the war. There were new printing technologies during this time, and the rise of the railroads meant that periodicals could be disseminated against to greater range of readers than ever before. And while the Northeast was a publishing hub, there were also journals, magazines, newspapers published all over the West, the South, and they are a rich resource of short stories about the war. Kathleen Diffley, who is also a part of this program, has divided those types of stories into 3 categories. Homestead stories, those are stories about life at home during the war. Romances, those tend to be stories in which a Northerner and a Southerner meet and fall in love, and they are seen as a story that is yearning for reconciliation between the two sections. And finally, adventure stories about soldiers' various escapades during the war. I like to focus on, and I have included in the material that you received from Texas Humanities, the case of George Dedlow, written by the physician Silas Ware Mitchell, and about a fictional hero who is a quadruple amputee whose spiritual limbs briefly return to him. I will just say here that it's a wonderful story to teach. It's short, it's compelling, it's a real page turner, but it also shows us these competing narratives of both a very realistic approach to the material. George Dedlow is a quadruple amputee who is making sense of his injuries in the war. And on the other hand, that residual transcendentalist, spiritualized accounting of life in America that occurred before the war. He ultimately is reconnected with his limbs by a spiritual seance. I don't want to spoil the story for you, but I will simply say that in my own experiences teaching the story, students always have a lot to say about the case of George Dedlow, and I'll conclude with his story, or Mitchell's story, by saying, when the story was published in the Atlantic Monthly, the magazine got dozens of letters from people who thought that George Dedlow was a real person rather than a fictional invention. Some of those readers actually sent money to help George Dedlow in his difficulties. And so we see here this new kind of realism provoked by the war is actually confusing readers who are not used to this kind of realistic portrayal of characters. Finally, women's literature of the war and the home front is a wonderful category of Civil War material that comes out of women's experiences during the war. Women assumed new duties, all kinds of new occupations in support of the war during this time, much as they would during the First and Second World Wars as well. They also happen to be the primary audiences of most periodicals and magazines. Women far and away read more fiction than men did at this time. That was true then as it is now. And at the same time, because of these things, the war created opportunities for literary women to write new kinds of work that could be published and that could advance their careers as writers. And the classic example of this is Louisa May Alcott, who all her life wanted to be a writer, and from a very early age wrote romances, plays, adventure novels and stories, none of which she could publish, none of which were accepted by publishers until the Civil War, when as a patriotic, pro-abolitionist young woman, she volunteered to become a nurse in the hospitals of Washington, D.C., much like Walt Whitman. And in her experiences, she wrote home to her family about the men she encountered, the duties she was assigned, and her family thought so much of those letters that they had them published, and eventually a book called Hospital Sketches was produced in 1863, making Louisa May Alcott a literary celebrity. As we all know, 5 years later, she writes Little Women, and the rest truly is history from there. But Hospital Sketches is her first published book. And like the case of George Dedlow, and as you will see in the excerpt that I have provided, her character, Tribulation Periwinkle, modeled on herself, is constantly confronting a harsh realism of war that challenges her idealism. And Hospital Sketches is a wonderful portrait of a young woman whose idealism is constantly confronting experiences that it could not anticipate. So those are the 5 primary forms of prose during the Civil War. Answering question number 1, how did literature shape the meaning of the war? Journalists, essayists, novelists, short story writers all tried to make sense of the war in terms of a residual religious and spiritual framework, but also increasingly in a realistic manner that honored the experience of soldiers and those who stayed at the home front. The war altered American literature in just that way, forcing it to become less idealistic, more realistic, and that really flourishes in the decades after the Civil War. And number three, I'll leave you to answer in your classrooms, but how might our encounters with Civil War prose reshape our views of American history? I think if you dig into the case of George Dedlow and Louisa May Alcott's hospital sketches with your students, you'll begin to think about the American Civil War in a different way. And with that, I will conclude my talk. I hope this has been helpful. And I will ask that my contact information be made available if you have any questions and would like to speak to me directly by email. Thanks so much.